there is a question from Katja Kostek.
Yes, thank you. I was really fascinated by your differentiation actually in between endangered species and endangered organisms. I didn't really think of that before, but I'm wondering if, I mean, is really this idea of hybridity and mixing, is that something we should be in a way afraid of or criticize? Isn't it kind of part of life and something like purity is an illusion? So if new species emerge out of this mixing, that's, for me, it seems like we could also consider it a good thing.
That's an excellent question, and it really is at the heart of a lot of current debates about things like environmental restoration. On the one hand, I think particularly when you're talking about plants, the phenomena like this are actually call into question the whole idea of species, because the textbook definition of a species is an organism that will not interbreed with other members. That's the boundary of a species, is that it will only reproduce with members of its own group and produce fertile offspring. And in the case with many plants, that's simply not the case. So the definition of species is coming in and out of focus. However, a lot of species conservation is based on the idea of a certain species, and I'll talk of protecting a particular species, and that definition of species is increasingly understood genomically rather than behaviorally. So I will talk about that a tiny bit more. But there are very different political opinions about whether we should celebrate the emergence of new species or whether the hybridization of new species is something to be is actually something to be problematized. And the key term in here is the logic of indigeneity, which I will also talk about in a second. But you've put your finger right on it. That's the key. That's the key question. That's the tension.
Great. I had other questions in the chat, but they were about the availability of the video. So I'm going to call for anyone to, if you have a question about the first part of the lecture, to make yourself known. And otherwise, I think we can continue with the lecture and save the questions for the end.
Great. I do hope I can talk about mulberry ejaculation.
I hope so too.
So it's precisely that set of questions that gave me pause. Why was I taught to lament the hybridity of the tenacious little mulberries growing, fruiting, and thriving in the middle of the highly disturbed and polluted landscape of High Park? Who says it's important that there be unhybrid red mulberries in Southern Ontario, especially when there are a lot of them in the species preferred more southerly latitudes? Why, when mulberries as an exuberant and fruity whole are clearly flourishing at the very northern extremes of their territory, is their apparently voluntary and enthusiastic mixing considered a botanical disaster, especially given that air pollution and habitat destruction affect Morus rubra much more than Morus alba? Several sources make mistakes clear. Most prominently, Parks Canada notes that the large number of white mulberry trees and hybrids across the landscape and the genetic makeup of these hybrids suggest that the red mulberry is being genetically assimilated by white mulberry. Even from the narrow perspective of Morus rubra genetic futurity, hybridization with the more cold-tolerant, atmospherically hardy, and disturbance-forgiving white mulberry seems an effective adaptive strategy more than it does an indicator of endangerment. However, what is clearly at issue for Parks Canada is neither the health of the plant nor its futurity, but the maintenance of a pure population of the species. The logic of genetic assimilation is important in this situation for several reasons. First, it insists that the identity and importance of the plant are, first and foremost, a matter of genetics and not, say, of the plant's relationship to human or larger ecological communities. Although hybrid mulberries are doing well, including the continued prolific production of berries that are important to many bird and animal species, including people, the insistence on the primacy of genetic purity in a larger narrative of species decline says a lot about the ecological and cultural priorities involved in the story. Mulberry's continuing gifts to multi-species relationships are overshadowed by a desire for species distinction. Although the two relations are by no means the same, this emphasis on mulberry purity looks a great deal like what has been named the vanishing indigene trope, in which colonizers express nostalgia for the loss of pure indigenous people as a way of drawing attention away from continued genocidal treatment of indigenous people who persist in the midst of ongoing settler colonialism. This narrative is a way of romanticizing a static, Edenic past in the service of making the present condition fallen and therefore profane and unworthy of care. Further, it is a way of drawing attention away from the structural relations that create the conditions for the loss in the first place. In the case of indigenous peoples, ongoing violent efforts by the settler colonial state to impoverish and disempower indigenous nations and sovereign land and kinship relations. And in the case of native species, ongoing work to destroy and pollute lands, habitat, and plant and animal relational ecologies. Both the Canadian and the US states have used arbitrary measures like blood quantum to regulate and impoverish indigenous family relations and land rights. In the case of hybrid mulberries, branding them less than pure has the effect of making them infinitely disposable in the service of maintaining a conservative and rigid roster of native flora and fauna. As Alexis Shotwell notes, writes, to be against purity in this sense is not to be for pollution, harm, sickness, or premature death. It is to be against the rhetorical and conceptual attempt to delineate and delimit the world into something separable, disentangled, and homogeneous. For mulberries, it is also about being aware of the specific work that the idea of endangerment through hybridization brings to the larger constellation of racialized colonial practices through which bodies and multi-species relationships are figured and managed by the settler colonial state. In her powerful analysis of recent trends toward understanding indigenous people and peoples in terms of genomic articulations of identity and ancestry, Kim Tallbear strongly criticizes biocolonial reductions of indigeneity to molecular sequencing in human genome diversity research and its political applications. She writes that genomic indigeneity is an articulation that focuses on biological descent and relations between groups across time and space. Within this articulation, an indigenous group becomes a biological-based or population-based category. What unites indigenous peoples globally from a genomic perspective is not opposition to colonialism or autochthonous cosmology, but relatively straightforward genetic descent from founder populations on particular continents. Although many indigenous people themselves also privilege biological connection to ancestors alongside connection to land, they have evolved a much more multifaceted definition of indigenous that entangles political self-determination and mutual networking for survival. Thinking with Tallbear, it seems pretty clear that indigenous people likely have something more complex and nuanced to say about mulberry identity as well. Perhaps Morris hybridization could also be considered a form of mutual networking for survival, especially given the strong relationship between the dispossession of indigenous lands and the destruction of red mulberry habitats in southern Ontario, and also the need to consider in those conditions how survival might need to involve adaptation, as it has done for indigenous peoples for millennia. Further, this understanding of Morris Alba invasion in Southern Ontario is not necessarily in accord with Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee understandings of invasive species. Although Indigenous nations, communities, and individuals lead multiple forms of plant care and habitat restoration, and there is no single view of invasive species among Indigenous peoples, one thing that is clearly important is what Rayo and Ogden call the invasive land ethic, in which all species changes are occurring in settler colonized landscapes, including both settler capitalist development and aggressively managerial forms of conservation. I am not an Indigenous person with a multi-generational tradition of intimacy with red mulberries. However, I have to question if changing species identity is anywhere near as important as the changed relationships that surround current mulberry transformations. As the Indigenous Stewardship Circle counsels in relations to programs of invasive species eradication in High Park, stigmatizing our relatives in this way would make it impossible to learn what it is that they are here to teach us. Perhaps the lesson is that we need to listen to intra-mulberry intimacies and what they are telling us about changes to the land rather than demonizing them. Again, I am in no way arguing that the regulation of Indigenous peoples' intimacies and relations is equivalent to the regulation of native plant intimacies and relations. Quite the opposite. I think it's deeply troubling that Parks Canada, as an apparatus of the Canadian state, is so concerned about Indigenous plants in the midst of the same state's ongoing dispossession of Indigenous communities, including their intimate relations with native plants as part of multi-species family networks. Settler movements for the preservation of native plant species very often proceed without attention to the larger Indigenous kinship networks in which plants and people are intertwined. The plants can be protected in a settler colonial understanding of the land without addressing questions of Indigenous land rights and relations because of settler colonial fantasies that the original state of the land is an unpopulated wilderness and not a matter of, for example, ongoing plant-people collaborations that involve movement, change, and co-adaptation. This colonial logic of plant indigeneity is a way of settlers keeping an idea of wilderness and continuing to displace the people, including their relations to plants with whom the land is intimate. It is not possible to engage in botanical decolonization without attending to the people with whom the plants are so deeply enmeshed, and without attending to what the plants are teaching all of their human cohabitants. More specifically, I'd like to argue that the mulberry problem in Southern Ontario is not one of Morris Alba incursion into Morris rubra species integrity. It's a problem of wastelanding, in which the robust spaces of ongoing people-plant relationships have been decimated to make way for settler capitalist developments that destroy any but the most instrumental and profitable ones. Other threats to red mulberries listed in the Parks Canada report are habitat fragmentation and pollution. While they are not at the very top of the endangerment cause list, especially when the combination of the two leads to further problems of red mulberry stress and disease. The pursuit of pure red mulberry is in this context a deeply problematic attempt to preserve a dubious colonial understanding of a plant species futurity without consideration of the people-plant futures of which the species is a part. The question of red mulberry endangerment can then be seen in a different light. Perhaps it is more important to think about the ongoing possibilities for relationship between people and mulberries than it is to insist on a particular genomic species identity. In her poem, Becoming 70, Muskoka poet Joy Harjo writes that we all have mulberry trees in the memory yard. They hold the place for skinned knees earned by small braveries, cousins you love who are gone, a father cutting a watermelon in the summer on the porch, and a mother so in love that her heart breaks. It will never be the same, yet all memory bends to fit. The idea that mulberry trees might be holders and keepers of memory in a world that will never be the same is an apt place to conclude today. In addition, according to to treat. Kivsi, one of the mulberry months, is an annual reminder of how the people, including non-human people, came together to overcome the trauma of creation. After a winter of bitter memory and lesson, at the time of the mulberry blossom, all shall come together again and seek to renew these teachings. Mulberries are both holders of memory in the midst of change then, and also reminders of the importance of multi-species comings together in the work of survival and renewal in these traumatic times. I'm not ashamed of the promiscuity of my mulberry relationships. I love their presence in my inheritance of Shakespeare, in their invitation to experience Tripoli and Detroit through sensuous connection with their leaves and fruit, in the complicated stories they have told me about seasons, cakes, bows, berries, dyes, and silk, in the lessons they've taught me about changes to the land I live in, and in the important things they and their Indigenous interlocutors have reminded me about history's relationships and obligations in the midst of settler colonialism. More particularly, my mulberry love affair has led me to think about intimacy in complex, Morris-centric ways. How the sex and species intimacies of mulberry trees are bound up with global, colonial, multi-species biopolitics, including the intersecting regulations and productions of both human and non-human intimacies, and how these specific relationships are involved in larger issues of living and loving in the conditions of what Anna Singh has appropriately called capitalist ruins. As Tallbear writes, recognizing possibilities of other kinds of intimacies, not focused on biological reproduction and making population, but on caretaking precious kin that come to us in diverse ways, is an important step to unsettling settler sex and family. Understanding our relationships with mulberries as intimacies invites us both to think carefully about how they have come to us and to relate to them in ways that are based in practices of respect and mutual flourishing rather than eradication and control. As I've explored, mulberries have a lot to tell us about histories, relations, desires, and futurities, ours, theirs, and all together. In addition, they invite possibilities for a concrete practice of close and loving cohabitation. Becoming intimate with mulberries demands that we ask how they invite us to join their webs of family and memory at the same time as we come to value them as our generous kin. In addition to listening respectfully to and learning from long traditions of mulberry and other multi-species kinship that emerge from Indigenous philosophies and practices, this concrete practice involves letting go of the desire to manage mulberry identities, understood as populations, resources, and problems, in favor of working with them to contribute to conditions of shared nourishment. As Robin Kimmerer writes, both the honor of giving and the humility of receiving are necessary halves of the equation. Indeed, perhaps once more people start to care for mulberries, more will also start to notice and relish in their abundant gifts. I'm going to end there so that there is time for queer mulberry sex.
Thank you so much for such a rich and inspiring lecture that touches on so many things I would like to talk more about, and I'm sure that our audience members would also like, I know they want to hear about the queer mulberry sex, but are there other questions as well, maybe? Marjolein Oele has a question.
Hello, Professor Sandilands. Very good to see you here, and thank you for a wonderful talk, bringing us through different academic exercises, but also on a very important political topic. My question, since I have a mulberry tree in my backyard in California, and I think indeed it is a black mulberry, I've been totally intrigued by the fact that this is a tree that's kind of well known by certain families in the area, that people use it, but that it's totally not a product that you see in the large produce aisle in California. I mean, I've been pondering this too, because it's very good fruit, but it's super delicate. You can only pick it in certain kind of episodes. And it's not ripe all at the same time. And before you know it, it goes to waste. So I've been thinking, as I've listened to your talk as well, that there's something about the fruit itself that seems to resist in terms of what it is to be sort of swallowed at whole. It can sort of become mechanized in a large food industry, even if it's been used or produced and used, as I learned today, in the silk industry. And there's something about the fruit itself that resists sort of these larger attempts to be homogenized. So it's been really used, as I know it, by other families in this intimate sphere of the home. And so I wanted to see what you think about this. Like, is there, you think, something about the mulberry tree that teaches us something about its resistance to larger ways of being homogenized, and even in its mixing abilities? Does it teach us something about the fact that it wants to do its own thing rather than be used or be amalgamated by larger thoughts?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you very much. I think my first answer would be that I think mulberries probably desire more than one thing, but that I also I think you have raised a very important question about how it is that mulberries have made an appearance in urban and domestic economies. So mulberries have been industrialized via silk production as Bombyx mori food, and they've also been industrialized and sort of mass distributed as street trees. They're particularly white mulberry is very pollution resistant. And it grows quite quickly. It's quite an attractive tree, and it was a favored tree for urban developers throughout the and actually until quite recently. The problem is that, and this is where we get to the problem around the delicacy of the fruit, which is actually even referenced in Shakespeare. Because the mulberries, as you know, are prolific producers. They produce hundreds of thousands, like a mature mulberry will produce hundreds of thousands of berries. They don't all ripen at the same time. A mature mulberry tends to be tall enough that it's out of reach. So unless they are cultivated to be quite short, you need a ladder to pick them. And the way that mulberries are typically harvested is that a bunch of people get together and put a big tarp at the bottom, and then you shake the tree and the mulberries all rain down. So they're not very practical to harvest, and the fruit doesn't keep, as I discovered. White mulberry fruit does dry fairly well. So you can find white mulberries for sale in a health food store, for example. Black mulberry and red mulberry do not keep, they do not dry well, and they also do not keep fresh. So that's why you will never, they're too perishable, they're too delicate, so you will never see them at the market. So they have never managed to achieve commercial success for that reason. I've never tried freezing them, but I gather that someone has, and that doesn't work very well either. They probably turn to mush. So the street trees that were planted in North American cities, and in fact in other cities, the paper mulberry was used as a street tree in Karachi, Pakistan, for example. The trees that were planted in urban centers were not planted for fruit. Benjamin Franklin notwithstanding, the vast majority of mulberry trees that were planted in urban centers were planted for other reasons, and they were planted with a decided preference for male trees rather than female trees, because the female trees plop purple mess on the ground, and the birds love them, and so there's purple mess all over everybody's cars. So there was a preferential planting of male trees. So almost exclusively the trees that you see along the sides of the roads in places like New York, Toronto, Detroit. Actually, Detroit's a bit different. New York and Toronto, they're male trees. The problem is that, and here we get into the mulberry ejaculation. The problem is that mulberry trees, male mulberry trees, are very allergenic. And they are, in fact, they produce an enormous amount of pollen, and they also release that pollen in, I'm going to get the quote, the fastest motion observed in biology, approaching the theoretical physical limits of movements in plants. The sudden movement of the pistil to eject the pollen is actually ballistic speed. So it's not too hard to think about mulberry ejaculations here. And they are so allergenic that that many cities in North America, such as Phoenix, Arizona, which use them a lot, have actually banned the planting of any more mulberry trees. Karachi, Pakistan, is the same. You're not allowed to plant a male mulberry tree. It's a punishable offense. And the other thing is that urban planners, and one in particular, is advocating sex changes for all of those male trees. So that a graft of a female, so you would keep the rootstock of the male tree, but you graft a female on top. And that's not because people want the berries, it's because they don't want the allergens. So you can see that and the whole problem would have been that whole problem would have been a non-problem if female trees had been planted randomly among the male ones, because the female trees absorb the pollen out of the air. That's what they do. That's the whole point. So there's this sort of it's an amazing story about the distrust and the dislike of mulberry fecundity, because it cannot be channeled into commercial activity. That the fruit, unlike apples, you really can't sell it, and the fear of excess and the fear of mess. So where the first story that I told is all about sort of the regulation of species identity, this is about the regulation of sexual identity. Although there are certainly long traditions of cultivating mulberry, like First Nations, like grafting. Grafting is a very old practice, and that's to get the kind of fruit that you want. But that kind of industrial scale of sexual control is actually, I think, quite unique to Western modernity, and thinking about trees, mulberries, as sites of sexual regulation. Certainly not the only plant that's a site of sexual regulation. Actually makes one think about how human intimacies and mulberry intimacies intersect in that very specifically sexual way. So that was a very long answer to your question, but you really opened the door into that whole other story about the regulation of mulberry sex.
I think that perhaps we should end by thanking you very much for such a rich and inspiring lecture that brings together so many questions of purity, hybridity, politics, colonization, indigeneity. Sorry. And I will be thinking through these things for the coming days, I'm sure, and I think the rest of the audience will also, and they will be thinking about queer mulberry sex, I think. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing your ideas with us. On behalf of everyone, thank you so much, and let's try another Zoom applause.
Thank you very much. It was delightful to share the stories with you, and thank you very much for your very excellent questions.